Hey YouTube, what's up? So my name is Michael. I want to thank you for joining me here today on this wonderful website. Over the last month and a half or so, I have found myself rekindling my passion for reading. I went from last year and even the first half of this year reading maybe 2 or 3 books to in the last month and a half I've read 16, I think. So that's not like the biggest number. It's not like 100 books or whatever, like you'll see some people talking about. But in terms of what I had been doing to what I'm doing now, that's a pretty big jump. In the course of that, I have found myself time and again standing in front of my roommates, ranting about these books that I'm reading and the worlds that I'm being immersed in and all of these characters that I'm falling in love with. And usually, in response to those rants, all I get back are blank stares and polite nods, because obviously they haven't read the books. So I decided it would probably be better for everybody's mental health if I found some other place where I could talk about the books I'm reading. So, hello, welcome. That's what I'm doing here today. That being said, the first book I finished after making that decision was Jade City by Fonda Lee. So the way I'm going to try and structure this video, and I'm probably going to fail, is I want to talk about first why I picked up the book, second what I didn't like about the book, and third what I did like about the book. Forgive me if I go off on tangents, I tend to do that. Anyway, so I picked up the book off of the general recommendation of the community. I keep an eye on the forums, r/fantasy, I watch booktubers, and Jade City had been talked about here and there, and it was pitched in such a way that I actually have a bit of a gripe with now that I've read it. But the way the book was pitched to me was basically as a magic plus kung fu book, and that on its own was pretty intriguing to me. I'm not a huge kung fu movie kind of guy, but it's kung fu. People like kung fu. And, I'm a fantasy reader, so if you put magic in something, I'm at least a little bit interested right off the bat. So that pitch was enough for me to decide to read the book eventually, at least. I bought it on Amazon, and it was sitting on my Kindle for a good little while. But the issue I had with the pitch is that once I read the book, I found all of those things to be true. It is very much a magic kung fu story with all those things that you would think would come along with that. But I think that there's an angle that a lot of the reviewers or the people pitching the book missed. That, at the very least for me, would have been a much bigger selling point, and I would have read the book a lot sooner than I did had I known it. And that is the idea that while it is a magic kung fu story, it is also a magic mob story. And anybody who knows me knows I'm a big fan of mob stories. I've got a collection on Blu-ray here of all the mafia movies that I've loved over the years. Anytime a new one that I find, I pick it up. I love that story structure, the power fantasy, the kind of escalation of violence. Take that to mean what you will about my psyche, but it's a story structure that has always appealed to me. So if I had known that about the book a little earlier, I probably would have picked it up a lot sooner than I did. So with that out of the way, first thing I want to talk about is the things that I took issue with in the book. There's not a ton of them, but I do have a little bit to say about them. So first things first, one of the most important things for me when I'm reading a fantasy book as a reader is the world building. It's really important for me to be able to feel immersed in a new world, right? To feel like I'm living somewhere else than Earth while I'm reading that book. I want to be transported to a different reality, basically. That's why I read fantasy, is escapism. I don't like Earth. I don't want to be here. And I really enjoy the feeling of being somewhere else and learning about the history and the cultures and the way that everything interacts in a new world. And so one of the issues that I took with this book is, while it does set itself in a different world, it's not on Earth as far as I can tell, it is pretty clearly just Earth with a different coat of paint on top, different names. The setting for the book is an island called Kekon, pretty clearly an analog for Japan. Throughout the story, there are foreign nations that are important to things that happen, and they have pretty clear, and like one of them is very clearly the United States. And so while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And like I said, I still very much enjoyed the book. It just doesn't scratch that world building itch to me, because I feel like I'm just reading a book set on Earth, but you've switched some names around. Anyway, that's not a big deal. I don't want to spend too much time on that. There's two big issues I had with the book. One of them being pacing, and one of them being one of the characters. So pacing wise, throughout the entire book, pacing is a bit of an issue, but it is mostly an issue in the first 25 to 30% of the book. I legitimately almost put the book down in the first 25%. It was so slow and so boring. It felt like nothing was happening, especially since, and this is why I'm bringing up these 2 points together because they're intertwined. Most of the time that you spend in that first 25%, you spend with one of the four main characters, and I just have a big issue with this specific character because she's the, in a lot of the mafia stories, you have the reluctant family member that, Michael in the first Godfather. They don't want to be involved with the organized crime part of it, right? They want to make their own world, or their own way in the world, as legitimately as they can. And she is that character in this book, at least at first. But I don't feel the turmoil that character is supposed to feel from her. She just feels like she's kind of sitting there staring at the world unfold in front of her and doing the things that are required of her to move the story along. Like she almost feels like a robot, this character. And so I think that's a huge part of why the first part of this book is so boring, is because you do spend so much of it with her. And then as the book progresses, multiple things happen to make it more engaging, and the pacing becomes much less of an issue the farther along you get in the book. Especially once you hit that 30% mark, I really feel like it starts to get rolling. But yeah, so those are most of my issues with the book. There's a couple of small gripes, like there's a really weird sex scene early on that I was worried was going to become a pattern, but it didn't, so it's not a big deal. Now I want to talk about the things that I did like, and there is quite a bit. Like I said, it is a mafia story, and that is a story structure that inherently appeals to me personally, so I very much enjoyed that. It has all of the kind of violence, vengeance-based catharsis that you want out of that. The tit for tat, you kill my guy, I kill two of your guys, I take out your bar, I blow up your headquarters, that kind of stuff, that escalation of violence that, for whatever reason, speaks to me and really kind of grips me. She pulled that off very well. That also, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. That ties into the next point in that the action and the combat scenes were incredibly well written. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the way she wrote them is that the action scenes were often the ones that were most important to progressing the plot. A lot of them were what moved the narrative along more so than the calmer dialogue scenes. And that may also be part of why the pacing felt like an issue, in that a lot of the plot progression happened during the high-paced action scenes, and the low-pacing scenes didn't do as much, and maybe that's part of why pacing was an issue. But like I said, the farther you get in the book, the less pacing becomes an issue. It just kind of becomes an avalanche and builds up over time, and just becomes, you just can't put the book down once you're about 60% of the way through. So while I also did spend a lot of time griping about that one character, you'll be happy to hear that the three other main characters, there's about four main characters who you really follow throughout the book. All three of the other ones are fantastic. They're all very unique with their own engaging personalities and motivations that make a lot of sense and are shown very clearly. You understand where each of them is coming from and why they're making the decisions that they do. And the little bits of information you get about their upbringing really ties in very well into the people that they are in the current day of the story. And so I really enjoyed it. I would actually have a really difficult time picking which one of those three is my favorite. And then one of the last things I want to talk about is an idea that I think has a lot of potential. So I spent a good deal of the first bit of this talking about how I felt the world building was pretty lackluster, and that is true. But one of the things that I find interesting that I wish more books would do, or at least books that I've read, maybe I just haven't read them, but it's the idea of a fantasy world set in a time that is more modern, right? So for whatever reason, anytime we write a fantasy book, we have the idea that it needs to be in a time akin to something like the Dark Ages, swords and shields and knights and all that kind of stuff. But I am very interested in the idea of a world with magic and elves and dwarves and all the stuff that you would normally think of as a fantasy world, but in a modern setting. That's been done here and there, and not always to great success. I mean, there was Bright from Netflix, I think is what it was called, was kind of that idea, but that was not well done. But I think it's an idea that has potential, and I would like to see more people try something with it, and hopefully in a way that goes a little bit more in depth than Jade City did. But with that being said, final thoughts. It's a great book. The same philosophy on rating as Daniel Green. 0 to 10, 5 is average. Anything above a 5 is progressively above average. Anything below a 5 is progressively below average. So yeah, I'd probably give Jade City a 6.5, leaning towards a 7, because it's very enjoyable, but it does have some pacing issues, and depending on how much willpower you have, you might find it difficult to get through the first bit of the book. But if you can, the story just starts to build in such a way that it doesn't stop, and it kind of becomes an avalanche and until you're done, and all of a sudden you're on the last page, and you have no idea how you got all the way through. So yeah, I definitely recommend it, especially if you're a big fan of the mafia story structure and that kind of narrative. It's definitely worth picking up. Anyway, thanks for watching. I know it's a little bit unpolished. This is my first attempt at this, but I plan on doing this for most of the books I read from here on out, just as a way to kind of talk about it. I tried to keep it spoiler free. I think I did a pretty good job. But if you liked it, hit the like button. If you feel like watching any other videos I do, hit subscribe, and I'll see you later.